Just water, please.
You got it. Where have you been?
I was just waiting.
Liar! You're always lying!
Let go of me!
The bar was the kind of place that made Josie feel like she walked through the wrong door. Dark with panels, low amber lighting, and bartenders who move like they've been doing this for 20 years without once spilling a drop. The kind of place where people ordered without looking at the menu because they already knew what everything cost and didn't care. Josie had looked at the menu. She'd looked at it for a long time, added up 3 items in her head, and ordered water. She'd been sitting there for 40 minutes. Her phone was face up on the table, which meant she'd been checking it without picking it up. Ryan had texted her at 6:15 saying, "Almost there," and it was now nearly 7. She straightened the cardboard coaster under her glass. Straightened it again. The bartender refilled her water without being asked, and she said thank you in a quiet, slightly embarrassed way people do when they know they've been sitting too long without spending any money. She didn't notice the man 2 tables behind her. Most people didn't, not at first. He wasn't loud. He wasn't performing. He was simply sitting there in a way that powerful men sometimes sit. Completely still, completely contained, like the space around him had already agreed to behave. His name was Conrad Mercer, and he was in the middle of a conversation that required his full attention, which was why he hadn't looked up when Josie walked in, and why he hadn't looked up in the 40 minutes since. He had a cigarette between 2 fingers that he hadn't lit yet. There was an unspoken rule in the bar about smoking indoors, and Conrad was the only person there who could break it without anyone saying a word. He just hadn't felt like it yet. Ryan arrived at 7:03, already irritated about something that had nothing to do with Josie, which was the worst kind of irritated to deal with because there was no fixing it. He dropped into the seat across from her, without taking off his jacket. He flagged down the bartender immediately, ordered something Josie couldn't afford, and then looked at her like he was already tired of whatever she was about to say. She hadn't said anything yet. She asked him if everything was okay. He said it was fine in the tone. That meant it wasn't. She asked how his day went. He told her she was doing the thing where she asked too many questions, and she apologized, which she did automatically, without thinking, the way you apologize when you've been trained to. It started low. His voice stayed controlled for about 4 minutes, and then something she said she would later try to remember what it was and never quite manage tipped him over. His voice came up, not screaming, but the kind of sharp, cutting volume that made the people at the next table go quiet without turning around. Josie kept her voice down, the way she always did, trying to bring the temperature of the conversation back to something manageable. He grabbed her wrist across the table. She flinched before she even processed what was happening, which said everything. Then he let go, stood halfway out of his seat, and slapped her. Open hand. Not a shove, not a grab. A slap, clean and deliberate, in the middle of a bar full of people. The room went the kind of quiet that isn't silence. It was the sound of 30 people holding their breath at the same time. Josie sat very still. Her hand came up to her face, slowly, not dramatically. She wasn't performing shock. She was just trying to locate herself inside the moment, which had stopped feeling real. Conrad finished his sentence. Not because he hadn't heard it. He had. But he was the kind of man who finished his sentences, who didn't let the world interrupt him mid-thought, who treated every reaction as something that could wait 30 seconds without losing anything important. He set down the small glass in his hand. He looked at the cigarette between his fingers, pressed it once against the edge of the ashtray, and put it out. Then he stood up. He didn't cross the room quickly. He didn't cross it slowly either. He just moved through it the way water moves through a space, without announcing itself, without asking permission. He stopped a few feet from Ryan's table. And he didn't touch Ryan, didn't raise his voice, didn't do anything that would read as threatening to someone who didn't already know who he was. He just looked at him. Ryan turned around because one of his instincts, buried under 2 years of bad decisions, was still working. And the moment he saw Conrad Mercer standing there, his face did something complicated and terrible. The irritation left. The posture changed. Something that looked very much like fear moved in and made itself comfortable. Conrad said 2 words to the man who had followed him across the room. 2 words, quiet enough that Josie couldn't hear them. Whatever they were, Ryan sat back down and stayed sitting. Then Conrad looked at Josie, not with warmth, not with concern. He looked at her the way someone looks at a spreadsheet, locating the relevant information, assessing what it meant, deciding what to do with it. She was young, maybe 21 or 22, still wearing a jacket that had been through too many winters. She had one hand still hovering near her face. She hadn't cried. He noted all of this in about 4 seconds and then said flatly, "Sit down." Josie stared at him. "I don't know you." Conrad said, "No, but he does." And he tilted his head slightly toward Ryan without looking at him. She looked at Ryan. Ryan was staring at the table. Conrad took out his phone and made a call that lasted under a minute. Short sentences, a name, an address. He hung up and looked back at Josie with the expression of a man who had just added a task to a list he didn't want to add it to. He told her someone would come to the bar in 10 minutes. He told her to go with them. He said it the way you give instructions to someone who works for you, not someone you've just met. She said she wasn't going anywhere with a stranger. He said, "That's your choice." And then he turned to leave, and he stopped, and without turning back around, he said, "Ryan works for my family. Until I know what he's told you, you're not safe going back to your apartment tonight." And then he left, not dramatically, just gone the way he arrived, without ceremony. His associate, a calm and broad-shouldered man named Patrick, who looked like he'd been told to be patient with people his whole career, sat down across from Josie and folded his hands on the table and waited. She almost laughed. The whole thing was so far outside anything that had ever happened to her that her brain kept trying to reframe it as something normal, something manageable. Then she looked at Patrick's face, and she stopped trying. The townhouse was in a part of the city where the buildings didn't have visible price tags because the price tags would have been embarrassing. Josie stood in the doorway of the guest room with her crossbody bag hanging off one shoulder and looked at a bathroom that was larger than her entire dorm room. The towels were folded in the way towels are folded in hotels where the staff have been doing it so long they do it without looking. There was a window that faced the street, with curtains that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. She said, "Okay," to the empty room. Then she put her bag down on the bed, went into the bathroom, and stood in front of the shower for 4 full minutes trying to figure out how it worked. There was one handle, which should have been simple, but the handle controlled both temperature and pressure in a way that wasn't labeled anywhere. And the first time she turned it, she got cold water at full blast directly in the face. She jumped back, grabbed a towel, stood there dripping in her clothes, and said a word she didn't usually say out loud. She found the housekeeper, a compact, efficient woman named Mrs. Aldine who moved through the house like she was on a schedule that had been set 30 years ago and had not been adjusted since, and told her quietly that she couldn't find the hot water. Mrs. Aldine walked to the bathroom, pointed at the handle, said nothing, walked out. Josie said, "Thank you," to a door that had already closed. She slept better than she expected to, which bothered her a little in the morning. She'd been in the apartment of a powerful stranger, in a situation she hadn't agreed to, and she'd slept for 7 hours like a person with nothing to worry about. Her brain was still trying to protect her from the full weight of what had happened in that bar, and she let it, because she didn't have a better plan. She came downstairs at 8:30 in yesterday's clothes, with her hair still damp, expecting to be alone. Conrad was at the kitchen table. A file was open in front of him. His coffee was untouched and probably cold, and he was on the phone saying something clipped and precise to whoever was on the other end. He glanced up when she walked in, held up one finger without breaking his sentence, and finished the call. He hung up, looked at her, said, "You're going to be here until I decide what to do with Ryan's situation. Don't make it complicated." Josie stood in the kitchen doorway in yesterday's clothes and thought about several responses. She landed on, "How long?" He said, he didn't know yet. She said she had class. He said, "Then go to class." That threw her. She'd been building herself up for an argument about leaving, about being held somewhere against her will, and he just told her to go to class. She stood there for a moment recalibrating, and then she asked a question that had been sitting in the back of her throat since last night. She asked why she couldn't just go back to her apartment, do it all herself, handle it without being kept in a townhouse that felt like a museum. Conrad closed the file. He looked at her with the full, flat patience of a man who was about to say something that he considered obvious and had no interest in softening. He said, "Ryan works for my family. Until I know what he told you and what you know, you're not a person to me. You're a loose end." He opened the file again. "I don't leave loose ends unmanaged." Josie stood there for a moment. Then she went back upstairs to change for class. The days settled into something that didn't have a name yet. Josie went to class. She came back. She did her reading at the kitchen table because the desk in the guest room faced a blank wall, and blank walls while studying made her feel like she was running out of oxygen. Mrs. Aldine tolerated this with the expression of a woman who had tolerated many things over the years and had stopped assigning opinions to them. Conrad moved to the house like weather, present, and then not, always doing something, always one conversation ahead of wherever she thought he was. He had people in and out constantly, conversations that stopped when she walked through a room, phones that were never left face up on any surface. He was impatient with everyone. She watched him cut off a man twice his age mid-sentence because the man had taken too long to get to the point. She watched him end a phone call by simply hanging up no goodbye because the answer he'd been given wasn't the answer he needed. He was not unkind to her specifically. He was just equally sharp with the whole world, and she happened to be living in it temporarily. Small things accumulated the way small things do when you're paying attention to someone without meaning to. She noticed he never ate breakfast. She noticed he kept the same 2 pens in the same pocket every day. She noticed he stood in the kitchen sometimes at 11 at night, not eating, not on his phone, just standing there in the particular stillness of a person who had too much going on inside to sleep. She noticed when the kitchen started stocking the cheap brand of orange juice she'd mentioned once, offhandedly, to Mrs. Aldine, the kind with extra pulp. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. One evening, she fell asleep on the couch with her economics textbook open across her chest. She'd meant to read one more chapter. She was out within 3 minutes. Conrad came through sometime after midnight, slow and without stopping, and stood at the edge of the living room looking at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read from the outside. He picked up the blanket from the armchair. He placed it on the armrest of the couch beside her, not over her, not tucked around her, just near enough that she'd find it if she woke up cold. Then he turned off the lamp at the end table and walked upstairs without making a sound. Josie woke up at 2 a.m, disoriented and stiff-necked, with a textbook on her chest and a blanket sitting 6 inches from her left hand. She looked at it for a long moment in the dark. She pulled it over herself and went back to sleep. Neither of them mentioned it in the morning. He was already on the phone. She poured herself a glass of orange juice, extra pulp, and sat down at the kitchen table with her notes, and the house kept moving around them like it always did. But something had shifted by about 3 degrees, quietly, without permission in the middle of the night, and neither of them was ready to name it yet. Ryan came in through the side entrance, which was the entrance Conrad used for people he didn't want seen arriving at the front door. Patrick brought him in at 10 a.m, which was early enough to feel like a summons and late enough that Ryan had probably spent the night convincing himself it wasn't as serious as it felt. It was more serious than it felt. Conrad was already at the table when Ryan sat down across from him. No file this time, no phone, just Conrad, with his coffee, looking at Ryan the way a man looks at something he's been meaning to deal with for a while and has finally found time for. Ryan tried to open with something casual, some version of a greeting, and Conrad let him finish the sentence and then said, "Tell me exactly how you were introduced to the girl." Ryan shifted in his seat. He said it was personal, that it had nothing to do with business. Conrad looked at him for a long moment and said, "Try again." It came out slowly, the way things come out when a person is trying to give up as little as possible while still giving up enough to survive the conversation. Ryan admitted that the introduction hadn't been accidental, that someone had pointed him toward Josie about 2 years ago, had given him her name, her college, the coffee shop she went on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He'd been told to get close to her, to keep her occupied and comfortable and distracted from the kind of questions that daughters sometimes start asking when they notice their fathers are stressed about something they won't explain. Her father had accessed financial documents he wasn't supposed to see, not stolen them, not copied them, just seen them briefly, during a meeting where someone on Conrad's family staff had been careless. The documents connected 3 political offices to a network of money that was not supposed to be connected to anything at all. Her father was an accountant. He understood what he'd seen. And someone in the Mercer operation had decided the cleanest solution was to keep his daughter close to someone they controlled, so that if her father ever decided to talk, there was already leverage in place. Ryan said all of this to the table, mostly glancing up at Conrad every few sentences like a man checking whether the ground beneath him was still solid. Conrad's expression didn't move. His jaw tightened once, a single muscle just below his ear, and then it released, and his face went back to being completely still. He said, "Who gave your name?" Ryan told him. The name landed in the room and stayed there. What neither of them knew was that Josie had come back from her 11 o'clock class 40 minutes early because her professor had ended the lecture before the hour. She'd come into the front door, dropped her bag at the bottom of the stairs, and started toward the kitchen for a glass of water. She stopped in the hallway when she heard Ryan's voice. She didn't move closer. She didn't have to. The house was old and well-built, but the hallway ran straight to the room where they were sitting, and Ryan wasn't being as quiet as he thought he was. She stood with one hand flat against the wall and listened to her boyfriend of 2 years explain to a stranger that she had been selected, targeted, handed to him like an assignment with a deadline. She stood there for the full length of it. She heard the name of the coffee shop. She went every Tuesday and Thursday. She heard the word leverage. She heard Ryan say, near the end, that she didn't know anything, that she'd never asked the right questions, that she was, and here he almost sounded relieved, not that complicated to manage. Josie took her hand off the wall. She went upstairs. She closed the door to her room without making a sound. She sat on the floor with her back against the foot of the bed, and she stayed there. The room was bright because she hadn't closed the curtains, and the light felt wrong for what she was doing, which was nothing, just sitting, just being very still inside a moment that kept expanding the longer she stayed in it. 2 years. She ran back through them the way you reread a chapter when you realize you missed something important. Every time Ryan had shown up exactly when she needed someone. Every time he'd steered her away from calling her father. Every time he'd made her feel like she was too sensitive, too anxious, too much, and she'd apologize for it. And she'd meant the apology because she believed him. She hadn't been loved. She'd been managed. She didn't cry. The feeling was too large and too flat for crying. It just sat in the center of her chest like something that had been there for a long time and had finally been given its correct name. Downstairs, Conrad finished conversation with Ryan in under 4 minutes after the confession. He told Patrick to handle the logistics. He stood up, buttoned his jacket out of habit, and walked out of the room. He passed her door on the way to his office. The light underneath it was off. It was 11:40 in the morning. He stood outside her door for a moment. He didn't knock. He wasn't the kind of man who knocked on doors to check on people, who asked if someone was okay and meant it as an open-ended question. He stood there, registered the dark line under the door, and walked away. He went to his office. He sat down. He did not immediately pick up his phone. She came downstairs at 11 that night. Conrad was still at the kitchen table, which was unusual. He was normally in his office by 9 and gone from common spaces entirely by 10. He was reading something, a document with a lot of columns, and he didn't look up when she sat down across from him. She said, "I heard what he said." Conrad set the document down. He looked at her across the table with the same flat, assessing expression he always had, and she looked back at him without dropping her eyes, which was something she'd been doing more often over the past week, without realizing it. He said, "Then you understand why you were here." She said, "Was I ever actually in danger, or were you just managing problem?" He set down his coffee cup. He said, "Both at the same time." She nodded slowly. She had expected deflection, and the directness of it surprised her. She sat with it for a moment, and then she asked the question she'd been turning over since she came downstairs. She asked him whether his family had known what Ryan was doing to her. Not the leverage part. The other part. The risk-grabbing. The flinching. The open hand in a quiet bar. The question sat in the space between them. Conrad said, "I didn't know." He paused. Someone else did. He didn't say the name again. He didn't need to. The way he said someone else carried the full weight of what he meant, which was that a person inside his family's operation had known a woman was being hurt as a functional part of a business strategy and had considered that acceptable. The muscle below his ear tightened again. Then it released. Josie said, "What happened to my father?" Conrad said, "Nothing. I closed it." She looked at him carefully. She asked what that meant. He said it meant the documents were no longer a problem. Her father was no longer a variable, and she was free to go home whenever she wanted. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without decoration, as though the weight of what he'd just done was not something that required acknowledgement. She understood, sitting across from him in that kitchen, that he had made a decision that cost him something inside his own family, and that he had no intention of explaining the cost. She said, "Thank you." He picked up his document. He said, "Go to sleep." She packed in the morning. It didn't take long, because she hadn't brought much. The crossbody bag, a change of clothes she'd had Patrick pick up from her apartment, her textbook, her charger, her notes. She zipped the bag and stood in the room for a moment, looking at the folded towels in the window and the blanket that was still on the couch downstairs because she'd folded it and left it there, and neither she nor Mrs. Aldine had moved it. She came downstairs, and Conrad was in the hallway outside his office, which meant he saw her the moment she reached the bottom of the stairs. He saw the bag. He looked at it for exactly a second. He said, "My brother arranged Ryan. I'm handling it internally." She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do with that. She said, "Okay." He said, "Your apartment isn't somewhere you should go back to immediately. Ryan still has a key." She said, "I'll change the locks." He said, "That takes 3 days to schedule in the city." She said, "Then I'll stay with a friend." He looked at her. She looked back. And then she said the thing that had been sitting in her chest since the night before. The thing she hadn't planned to say, but which came out anyway, because she was tired of carrying it around in a house where everything went unspoken. She said, "You told me I wasn't a person to you, that I was a loose end." She wasn't angry when she said it. She was just stating it, the way you state a fact you want someone to confirm or correct. Conrad stood in the hallway and said nothing. It was a different kind of silence from his usual ones. His usual silences were controlled, deliberate, the silence of a man who spoke only when it was worth speaking. This silence was the kind that comes from not having a prepared answer, from being asked something that the calculations don't cover. She was close enough that she could see him working through it and not arriving anywhere. She said, almost to herself quietly, "I really didn't know anything, Conrad." It was the first time she'd used his name. It came out without ceremony, without weight, just his name and her voice, which turned out to be a different thing than she expected. He said quietly, "I know that now." She held his eyes for one more moment. Then she picked up her bag, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and walked to the front door. He didn't stop her. She didn't look back. The door closed behind her. He stood in the hallway for a long time after, in the particular stillness of a man who had just watched something leave that he hadn't known he was keeping. The Mercer family dinner was 3 days later, in the formal dining room of the main house, which was 40 minutes outside the city, and had a long driveway lined with lights that were on a timer. Conrad came because attendance at these dinners was not optional. It had never been optional. He sat in his usual chair, to the right of his father, and worked through a meal the way he worked through most obligations, efficiently, without complaint, without genuine engagement. His father was in good form. He moved through the agenda items between courses the way he always did, smoothly, connecting political names and financial arrangements with the ease of a man who had been doing it for 30 years. Conrad's brother sat across the table and kept his eyes on his plate more than usual, which Conrad noticed and filed away. His father reached the last item near the end of the meal. He mentioned Josie's father by name, lightly, casually, as a matter that still required a clean resolution. He used the word exposure, and then he looked at Conrad, because Conrad had been the one managing it. Conrad set his fork down. He looked at his father across the table, and he said, "That's done." I closed it. 4 words, level and clear, with no preamble and no explanation attached. His father looked at him. Conrad picked his fork back up, The table moved on, because tables at Mercer dinners always moved on. But the air in the room had changed in a way that everyone present could feel, and no one commented on. His father moved to the next topic. His brother said something agreeable and forgettable. The staff refilled the water glasses. Conrad finished his meal. He drove back to the city. He did not explain himself to anyone that night or after, but his father knew, and his brother knew, and something that had been arranged and accepted and treated as settled had been unilaterally dismantled by the man who was supposed to maintain it. And that would have consequences that were still a few weeks away from arriving. Conrad knew that too. He'd done it anyway. A week later, Josie was at the bar. She was there with a classmate named Priya, who talked fast and laughed louder than the room required. And Josie was grateful for both of those things. She was wearing a sweater that actually fit her. Green, the kind of color she never used to let herself wear because Ryan had once said it was too much. She bought it 3 days ago. It was the first thing she bought for herself in longer than she could clearly remember. She was laughing at something Priya said when she glanced toward the back of the room. It was a habit. She understood that now. The way her eyes moved to that corner of the bar automatically. The way a person's eyes move to a door they've walked through enough times that the body remembers before the mind does. Conrad was there. Same table. He was not alone. Patrick was across from him, and there were papers between them. But the dynamic was quieter than business. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't cutting anyone off mid-sentence. He had a cigarette between 2 fingers. It was unlit. She looked at him across the room, and he looked up at almost the same moment. The way people sometimes do when they've been aware of each other, without looking. No wave, no expression that gave anything away. Just eye contact, straight across the length of the bar, lasting 3 full seconds longer than coincidence could explain. Then she turned back to Priya, who was already on to the next story. She didn't tell Priya about him. She didn't try to explain what the look meant or whether it meant anything, or what the unlit cigarette in the hand of a man who always lit his cigarette was supposed to say. She just picked up her glass and settled back into the conversation and stayed present in a way she hadn't been in a long time. She didn't check her phone once for the rest of the night. There was no one she was waiting to hear from, no one she was bracing for. She was just there, in the bar, in the green sweater, laughing at the right moments. Across the room, Conrad set the cigarette down on the edge of the ashtray, without lighting it. He looked back at his papers. But a few minutes later, his eyes moved back across the room once more. Briefly, the way they do when something has already made itself at home in the back of your mind, without asking permission. She was still laughing. She looked like herself. He looked back at his papers and didn't look up again. But for the rest of the evening, the cigarette stayed where he'd put it, cold, unlit, sitting at the edge of the ashtray, like a small and quiet decision. And that was enough.
If you enjoy these stories, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It really helps more than you might think.